Hi, good morning, everyone. Okay, so I have a couple of slides to run us through. So thank you so much for that very kind introduction. So again, I'm from Microsoft Research AI for Science. And at AI for Science, we believe that scientific discovery is the most important use of AI. And why do we think that? Well, we've seen scientific discovery and its impact on technology change humanity from cave dwellers to space explorers. And we all realize now that we're at a start of an S-curve of disruption, really driven by deep learning and AI. And we also think it's the most exciting application of AI because it's the most rich and complex. So AI for Science, of course, spans broad ranges of length and time, right? Many applications can come from scientific discovery. Our focus in AI for Science is right here within molecules, proteins, and crystals. But you might be wondering why we're not just saying that we can use a large language model and be done with it. Can we take ChatGPT and just solve the scientific discovery challenge just like that? And the answer is actually no. However, I will say that large language models bring two really remarkable properties that are actually very useful in science. So the first one is that they act as sophisticated reasoning engines. So as these models scale, their ability to deduce and reason becomes even more powerful. And of course, that's very important and very useful in science. The second one is that they possess a deep understanding of natural language. However, we think that term is actually misnamed because what it really does is it understands human language. But the language of nature, the language of science, the language of physics, biology, and chemistry is much deeper, much more complex. And so what we really need to do is we need to understand and learn the language of nature. But what is it that makes scientific discovery different? So there are actually four things. The first one is that scientific discovery requires precise numerical computation. So we might need to calculate the properties of molecules and materials. And large language models are natively very bad at that. They're actually quite bad at doing these complex calculations. The second one is that experimentation is the ultimate arbiter of truth in scientific discovery. We must have scientific discovery embedded into the experimental loop, right? So anytime we use science and AI, we need to have experiment directly in there as well. And very importantly, the training data. So when you think about large language models, we have the scale of the internet available to us for training. However, by contrast, in science, the data is actually very scarce. So we might need to compute it, which can be very expensive, or we can generate it through complex experiments in the lab. But either way, it tends to be scarce, it tends to be limited, and it's harder to obtain. But there is a silver lining, which I'll talk a little bit more about, and that's the fact that we have the known laws of physics in scientific discovery. So for many centuries, many of these known laws of physics are described by differential equations. And those differential equations describe the world with really remarkable accuracy over those vast ranges of length and time. So let me say a little bit more about that, what we call prior knowledge, right? So if scientific discovery, these laws of physics are described by differential equations. Think Newton's laws of motion, the law of gravity, Maxwell's equations of electrodynamics, or more recently, the equations of quantum physics. So one of those equations, which you may or may not be familiar with, is Schrödinger's equation. Okay, so this is a simplified form of Schrödinger's equation, and it describes the behavior of electrons in a molecular system. However, it's computationally very expensive to solve. So it can be exponential in the number of electrons, so the amount of compute it would be required to actually compute it exactly is also exponential. However, that provides a very important foundation for us, especially as we start to use it to design new molecules and materials. So you can think of that forward problem as a simulator. And there's been many different approximations to this equation. One of the most popular ones is density functional theory. And we can use that to actually compute an approximation which will give us those desired properties of a molecule or material. But even those approximations can be extremely computationally expensive. But what we can do is we can think of this not necessarily as just a solver to solve those properties, but AI provides a new opportunity for us. We can now think of this as a way of generating synthetic training data. So instead of just calculating the properties of the molecular material, we can generate more and more data using this, and that synthetic training data can then be used to train deep learning models, which we'll call AI emulators. And those AI emulators can be many orders of magnitude faster and more efficient than the original simulator. Now, there are other forms of prior knowledge that we can bring in as well. So there are many properties of molecules, right? So energy being one of them. So if you take a molecule and you rotate it, the energy stays the same. We call that invariance. Likewise, if there's a dipole moment on the molecule, like a little bar magnet, and we rotate that, the bar magnet, the dipole moment will rotate with it. That's an example of equivariance. And there are many other forms of prior knowledge we can consider as well. Conservation laws, energy, mass, momentum, and charge are all conserved as well. And those can complement the fact that we have this scarcity of data challenge. So it's analogous to the fact that a dog is a dog no matter where it appears within the image, and those types of prior knowledge are already used today in things like computer vision systems. Now, how do we make use of that in practice, right? So there is a fundamental theorem at the heart of machine learning called the no free lunch theorem. And basically what this says is that you cannot learn purely from data. You have to have some sort of assumption, otherwise known as prior knowledge. And in the machine learning context, we call that inductive bias. So if you think about large language models, we've got lots and lots of data and very lightweight bias. But in the case of scientific discovery, AI, we might not have very much data, or we can compute the data, but it's difficult to obtain. But we've got these deep, rich inductive biases driven by those laws of physics. So let me give you an example of how this is used in practice. So some of our partners at Microsoft Azure Quantum, they have a goal of generating new electrolytes for lithium-ion batteries, with a particular goal to replace some of that expensive, scarce lithium with cheap, widely available sodium. So essentially, this is a screening process. They started with over 32 million different materials generated in a computer. They go through a series of complex and expensive screening steps, some of which include human in the loop, just to end up with one potential candidate at the end of it. Now, some of these steps in the screening process include density functional theory, which I mentioned is an approximation to that Schrodinger equation. And so what they're able to do is exactly what I've just described. They can use those solutions to DFT, to train an AI emulator, and then that AI emulator is able to do this screening much, much faster. In fact, it was able to do it 3 orders of magnitude faster than the conventional screening process. And anytime something gets 3 orders of magnitude faster, that can truly be classed as a disruption. So here's an example. So that one candidate that was synthesized through this process was put together by our partners at Pacific Northwest National Lab. So you can see it in a test tube here. And that was actually presented at Davos this year. This is an image of the test cells being fabricated. Those cells, the batteries being tested. And then finally, here's a little alarm clock that actually proves that it works. And this alarm clock is charged by 70% less lithium than the traditional lithium-ion battery. But really, this is just the beginning. So another way we can do this is, instead of just thinking about speeding up that screening process, we can also use generative AI to narrow down on the right candidates at the beginning, the very top of that funnel. So a few weeks ago, we announced MatterGen. This is a generative AI model for generating materials with specific properties. So instead of screening everything all at once, we can narrow that down to just the properties that we're actually looking for. Now, this is using a technique called diffusion models. So some of you might be familiar with that already. It's used widely already. You might know that it's used in image and video applications, especially DALL-E and Sora from OpenAI. Now, this is only just the beginning, and materials is just one application. There are many other things as well, including drug discovery. So now, very sadly, in 2022, 1.3 million people died of tuberculosis. This is a major global health problem that especially affects middle and low-income countries. And it's actually made worse by the fact that tuberculosis has actually developed a strong mutational resistance to the leading treatment. So we need to do something about this. And we can approach this, again, by deep learning. So I'll walk you through some of the architecture of our solution called MatterGen. That's short for Target-Aware Molecular Generation. And so what we've done is we've started out by training a language model on SMILE strings. So SMILE strings are a one-dimensional representation of a molecule, kind of like words in language. So we've trained a language model with self-attention, and that allows us to predict the next token. But of course, we don't want to generate molecules at random, right? We want to generate molecules that bind to a specific protein. And so we've trained another transformer model that represents that protein. It encodes that protein. So the idea here is we're looking for the binding site of that protein, and we can encode the properties of that binding site. So the molecule is going to bind to that protein in some way, and it's going to affect and impact the function of that protein, either by revving it up or shutting it down, or impacting some other mechanism within the body. And we can include the geometric constraints of that protein and the invariance and equivariance properties that I described before. Now, another thing we want to do is we want to be able to take molecules that we know exist already, and we want to be able to improve the binding efficiency of it. So we use another technique here called a variational autoencoder, and that allows us to take molecules that we know have a way of binding to that protein and generating variability. Then finally what we do is we bring the outputs of those two encoders together, bring it together with that SMILES language model, and we're able to generate new molecules in this way. So once the model is trained, we can introduce a protein to it. So this is a known protease that's used in tuberculosis. We can provide it with a molecule, a leading molecule that we know binds to that protein, and we're able to generate molecules which we hope will have an improved binding efficacy compared to the original molecule. So we did this in collaboration with GIDI, the Global Health Drug Discovery Institute, and they were able to synthesize many of these compounds and actually found that one of these has over 100 times improved binding efficacy of the protease than the original molecule. Now, this is a long way before this becomes something like a medicine that's actually available to patients, but it's promising results indeed, and good to follow forward. Okay, so this is the team we have. We are a mix of ML engineers, ML researchers, people that have spent their entire lives working in the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, and biology, number of program managers. So this was us all at an offsite recently. And hopefully you've gotten a glimpse on how AI can really transform scientific discovery. I've given you two applications, materials, and also drug discovery. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Please take a seat. I love this. What I find particularly wonderful is that these technologies developed for processing natural languages, English, Mandarin, and not just languages, right? You mentioned diffusion models, which are developed to generate images. We've all played around with those kind of tools, are being used for hardcore science, really. Yeah. And is it the same technology? I mean, are you using like a version of GPT-4?
So large language models, GPT-4, are certainly very useful in scientific discovery and science AI. So just like I said, there's two properties, reasoning engines and actually an understanding of human language are all very useful within science. So we'll use them certainly across the applications that we build. But we do need to train our own language models in order to get the functionality and the precision and accuracy that we would look for in science. So you might think about these large language models as being an operator, as an agent that might work between some of these models and their tasks.
Right. But the core concept of the technology is being applied rather than the syntax of of English, you're applying it to sort of the syntax of the languages of life, sort of the molecular grammars or proteins.
Yeah, exactly. So it's about understanding and learning that language of nature, precisely.
Got you. Just to get a sense of like what this really means, I mean, you obviously have a background, you're a quantum chemist, so you know very much what it's like to be a sort of, a day job scientist. What is different now compared to how it was then? I mean, if you were doing that work today, how different would your work be, the activities that you actually do?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't think any of us could have predicted really just the scale and the tremendous leaps we've made in the past couple of years in AI. Certainly when I got into this field many years ago, I didn't expect to be at sort of this GPT, large language moment.
Yeah.
So I think we've all been really surprised by the capacity of these models and also kind of what's next. Like we can almost not even predict what's next because it's all I can guarantee is it's going to be something amazing. So certainly I think how would things have changed, right? So I think if we're able to actually understand the language of nature, if we're able to actually build these scientific AI systems, it won't just be that we can create solutions to existing known laws of physics or find existing materials and molecules. I think that even new opportunities to discover more within science, to come up with new theories. So these models might be able to help us create a deeper understanding of the universe beyond what we even know today.
Does it change, I mean, as, if I were a scientist, does it change the nature of what I do, how I think about that work, generating hypotheses and designing experiments? I mean, are scientists trained today essentially to do something a little bit different than they would have been 5-10 years ago?
I think so. If you're a scientist, if you're a medicinal chemist within a lab in a pharmaceutical company or in a materials company, I think there are many bottlenecks that happen within these processes and within the lab. So the idea here is that these tools will augment the scientist, right? It becomes a partner. It becomes an assistant in a way. So it's able to help us, not go through many failed experiments just to find one that might work, but actually start with a higher probability of success. If you think about that funnel that I had in the beginning, if we can narrow down the number of candidates that we start with at the top of that funnel, then the probability of finding one at the end, or many even at the end, with the actual activity that we're looking for, is more likely. And also, I think scientists actually spend a lot of time on failed experiments. And that actually generates the high attrition and the high cost of things like pharmaceuticals. So if we can get better at improving our probability of success, of augmenting our decision making so that we start with better materials to start with, better molecules to start with, then we'll have more efficient processes in the end.
Yeah, I want to come back to that big promise in a second, but just reminder to the audience that if you have a question, then put your hand up and someone with a mic will come round, and I'll come to you in a minute. But just while the mics are moving around the room, like that big promise, it gets sort of, say you're trying to come up with a new drug. My understanding is that it stops you going down sort of a dead end. You can figure out much more quickly whether something is worth pursuing. There's still sort of painstaking lab work that needs to be done, but you can do it only on those candidates that you expect to have promise of success. And I think this number changes, and I don't keep up because it's happening quickly, but there's at least 24 drugs that have reached clinical trials that have been developed with the use of AI in some sense. I mean, it's gray exactly, lots of different techniques are being used. But those drugs are now moving through clinical trials. None yet have actually gone through all the phases and are on the market. So this is a really exciting period where sort of it's going to be proven whether this approach really does lead to drugs which save costs, et cetera. We save time getting to clinical trials, but clinical trials themselves are slow necessarily, and we want them to be because it's where we test the safety and the efficacy in humans. Should we expect an AI-designed drug to have a sort of a leg up even at the clinical trial stage, or do we just need to sort of wait and see?
So I think a clinical candidate that's discovered by AI, of course, AI can be applied at many different stages of the R&D process. It could be used in the very beginning when we're identifying targets. It could be used during the generation of a lead candidate, or it could be used in the stages of clinical, right? So when you're actually testing the molecule for safety and efficacy within humans. And I think no matter which stage it comes from, that molecule needs to go through rigorous testing and regulatory control, right? Because at the end of the day, it's about testing whether that molecule is safe enough and efficacious enough to actually do what we want it to do without harming patients, right? So I think that whichever part of the pipeline that the AI is applied, you still need to go through those rigorous controls. So I don't think there will be any pass there. But I do think that the idea is that it shortens the timeline to go from a biological target to a clinical candidate. And by shortening that timeline, we can potentially get those medicines to the patients faster.
Right. And if you do then fail, you've wasted less time and less money getting to it, so you can go back. And another thing which I think is interesting, we've seen come up recently, we've had more than one big lab has used AI to sort of generate vast new databases of candidates of proteins and materials. And on one hand, which is really exciting, that all these new discoveries that no group of humans could make in centuries. And yet that's also a lot of noise, and it still takes a lot of work to figure out which of those candidates are going to be useful. How do you balance actually making more work rather than less work?
Yeah, great question. I think that the most important thing is that you need to have these, anything that's presented in a database or in a paper needs to be experimentally validated. Okay, so something, molecular material, needs to actually be useful within the real world. And how do we determine that, right? So it's through rigorous testing, rigorous experimentation. One of the biggest bottlenecks in both materials and drug discovery is synthesis. So we can design molecules all we want. We can find beautiful molecules that we can generate in a computer. But if we can't actually go and make them in a lab, then it's not very useful to anyone. So I think complementing the large data that we'll be generating from this is making sure that we can actually create it in the lab.
Right, I think I'll come to the room as a question there, gentlemen. Would you stand up and say who you are and what your affiliation is?
My name is Aryan. I've got a background in theoretical physics from Imperial College London and founder as well. I'd like to ask about just its use in AI's use in natural sciences, particularly, let's say, from a theoretical physics perspective, because that's what I can talk of. So Elias Sutskever, as Will interviewed him last year, he said that he's primarily involved in the use of AI not for advancing science, but seeing whether we should even apply it to science, more into the ethics of artificial intelligence, being a company which is leading this way, OpenAI, leading towards AGI. It doesn't really seem to comply with advancing science, more towards advancing artificial intelligence to reach AGI. So I was wondering, first of all, as an objective question, are these science-based models based on GPT-4? Like, are they fine-tuned versions, or are they built from scratch?
They're built from scratch. They're not fine-tuned versions.
Okay, and the second question would be, how does that align with other startups' missions, like advancing science and advancing for AGI? Or can they come together as well?
That's a good question. So I will say that, as I mentioned before, large language models do play an important role here. One as reasoning engines and one as an interface to human language. And those are needed to essentially execute those models. But in order to actually learn the language of science, we need to train a new model, a new architecture that understands those laws of physics and can do the actual complex calculations and computation, which language models are not very good at. And so, but by combining those things, you can create a system that's much more powerful, right? And so I think they kind of go hand in hand. There are startup companies, OpenAI, many others that are working on this AGI problem, right? But if we can complement that with actually something that can understand science, then the ability for it to understand the world and help us understand the world as well is even more powerful.
Yeah. And you were talking about that slide on bias and data and how science-based LLMs need to have data like as a more priority than bias. I was thinking about it in terms of innovative scientific thinking. Let's say groundbreaking discoveries from Schrödinger. Those kind of things, those kind of discoveries, they start from a very strong personal bias and theoretical work, and then it's experimentally validated, right? Even after like 20, 30 years, there's no experimental proof for any of that. So where does that kind of thinking come into these LLMs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So of course we have the known laws of physics today, but that doesn't necessarily mean it ends there. So perhaps we can use these scientific AI systems to actually understand new equations of science, to find new differential equations, which we can actually validate experimentally. So I think that the breadth of applicability here is really broad. So it's not just about using the existing ones, but using this to discover new things within science.
Thank you. It's worth saying that the previous question, I mean, AI is a very, very broad church. I mean, there are many applications and hopes and fears for AI as there are sort of people working in it. We're almost out of time, but I just want to end, what are you personally excited about most as a scientist, as someone working in the space, about what kind of breakthrough or improvement to the world?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think I'm just excited about the opportunity for AI to allow us to do things that we didn't think were possible before. Like I said, the amount of progress that we've made in such a short amount of time, we cannot even predict what next weekend will look like, much less next year. So it's really amazing just the scale of disruption that we're on. I mentioned we're on an S-curve of change, and I really think that's true. So I think it's just going to be amazing to see what new molecules, what new materials we're able to make, what new findings within science we'll be able to make. That's really going to impact and improve the lives of humanity.
Thank you.
Thank you.